Hello, my name is Teixeira Melo, and I come from the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And I come to talk to you about the role of the family's potential for change in the construction of positive and sustainable futures. So the context of this presentation is really the context that the organizers have set up for us, and it has to do with precisely the construction of positive and sustainable futures, and the fact that the world's most pressing challenges are calling for widespread systemic changes in their coordination across different levels of organization of society. So families in their multiple forms are still a fundamental social unit and a proximal source of influence over the individuals, both shaped by and shaping their environments. And families are, we know, fundamental for the well-being of individuals and are capable themselves as a systemic unity of being resilient and of supporting individual resilience. But our point is that families could be targeted as agents of or for change towards more positive, sustainable futures, when we consider that the dynamics of their relations may scaffold the development of positive and collective individual patterns of behavior that might contribute to building more loving communities, to ensure intergenerational justice, and to work towards a more harmonious existence with nature, building more positive and more positive environments for human flourishing. So whilst families are a privileged context for educating the next generations, they are also the context where caregivers and educators may themselves become more susceptible and more susceptible to influence and open to change. And this is really the point that we want to focus. So the challenge is, how do we activate and how do we mobilize the potential that might exist in family relations to promote and support change, both in individual and collective patterns of behavior, changes that are necessary then to address these pressing societal challenges towards more positive and sustainable futures? How do we develop these family interventions that can propel this potential so that it can scaffold those individual changes? But also, how do we help families themselves develop patterns of behavior that are more flexible, more adaptive, and fit to meet the current needs of the challenges of the present and the future in contexts that are likely to be of high uncertainty? So our proposal is to build upon a recent theoretical framework developed that conceptualizes the family as a complex system, and from which we can derive this notion of potential for change, and more specifically of the family's internal potential for change as being associated with the activation of patterns of a special pattern actually of emergent properties of the family bonds, actually of bonds in general, but I'm working with families right now, that sustain a relational force that we call love force, that is characterized by being potentially transformative, by being motivational, propelling, and supportive of and driving the change of the individuals and their capacity to perform changes in their own relations and in others. So the activation of these patterns leads to transformations in the family across levels of organization. So the family's potential for change then becomes a key concept in our perspective to guide research and practice, which is aimed at building more positive and sustainable futures and in promoting individual and collective behaviors that are supportive of the necessary transformations, because these processes that are implicated in the activation of love force are really just essential change processes that can just help individuals change and help families change, but help individuals change also even in relation to other systems. So I won't have time to detail the model of the family as a complex system. I just want to put this in context and say that the context of this research started with the investigation of change and resilience processes in multi-challenge families in a combination of an inductive and a grounded theory-informed approach with an abductive methodology that used a complexity frame of reference as a heuristic lens to analyze family relations. So a new model was developed where the family is conceived as a complex system with properties that are known of other complex systems, namely complex adaptive systems. And we believe that this model affords a much more integrated understanding of the family's complexity and above all of its change processes. And it conceptualizes the family really as a collective entity as being sustained in this set of emergent properties that come out of the coupling processes. So the model was developed with a particular focus on the coupling processes within the family, of how does a family emerge, how do families bond emerge, what characterizes them, and why do they seem to be so important in helping us adapt, in helping us change, and in helping us face multiple challenges. So love force emerged from our analysis as a key concept representing the core driving force, the core driving feature of the complexity of the family that was underlying change and resilience processes. And it was a fundamental change process for driving parental change in cases of child protection, in cases of child abuse, in families that were supported by practitioners while they were dealing with multiple challenges, but also in families that were dealing with these challenges on their own in community settings. So this is just a graphical representation of some core features of the conceptual model that I won't have time to detail. And on the right, you'll have some of the key features of complex systems that can also be seen in families. But the focus of this presentation is here on the internal potential for change that comes and that emerges from the internal coupling processes in the family. And of course, this potential is then constrained and facilitated, and it will affect other dimensions of family function, namely, and will depend on them too, namely the frames of meaning and dimensions such as more functional aspects like roles, rules, routines, or other types of patterns. But as I said, I will be focusing here on this internal potential for change. So imagine a family is really a collection of individuals that establish particular types of bonds, but these individuals are coupled with each other. So we try to understand in what ways do individuals become interdependent of each other, and the coupling processes is that. So imagine that the individuals bring contributions towards their relationships, and that these contributions can be described as a sort of a particle in a network of contributions, and they interact amongst them, so that some of these properties might be a bit more critical, and once they're present or more active, they will influence the others. Some will be a bit more peripheral, but overall they interact in very nonlinear ways to define a mode of being with others. And so we feel that there is a signature of the other person that's very unique in the way that they interact with us. So this is what these arrows here represent. It's kind of like our contributions to the coupling relationship, what we bring to the relationship with the other, and the other will bring their own things. Now, these contributions will need to be coordinated, and we can classify this coordination too according to a certain number of properties. But again, we can see these properties as a sort of particles in a network, and they interact amongst each other, and they will become again, a very unique signature of that relationship or of that interaction. So all of these dimensions, they're very important, but they don't necessarily determine in a linear way the nature of the bond and what the effects of the bond will be, because the bond is really emergent. I'll come back to this in a moment, but what I'd like to show you here is that you can see the lower levels of the organization of the relation here when we have the individual coupling and the reciprocal coupling. And then from these processes and from their non-linear interaction within levels and between levels, a new set of properties emerges that defines relationships, and that we can identify through their effects on the individuals and on the dynamic of their relationship. So top-down effects, but are not to be found at these lower levels. So they are truly novel, they are truly emergent, and they belong to the relation, to the bond. So these emergent properties as a collective pattern then define also the particular identity of a bond that is very unique, because these properties are also quite unique. Now, these properties can be activated, and they can be remain activated, but they can also be dormant, and they interact also with each other, but they define this coherent pattern of effects. So you can see this is a list of just examples of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about individual coupling properties, for example, and they're all conceptualized as complementary pairs and dynamic complementary pairs. So there will be variations and change over time across them. And we're talking about things such as attention to the other, empathy, positivity, responsibility, all individual dimensions that, for example, positive psychology has been studying a lot. But it's not just each individual dimension, it's the way that they vary, and it's the interaction amongst them that's important in the model, and also how they interact then with the nature of the interaction, of the coordination between individuals. And so we're talking about properties such as synchronization, or the degree to which the interaction amplifies the positive that is brought by each individual, the the positivity of their shared experiences, the reciprocity of their contributions, and many more. So what you see here again is that this bond, and this could be a temporary bond that's created just in a moment in the interaction, can be seen a bit like a string, and these properties define the effects that it will have, but they create a field of influence over the individuals, and top down, it will constrain their behavior, and it will change the type of contributions that they will further give to the interaction and to the relation, and also change the dynamics of that interaction. So the bonds will also interact amongst themselves in more constructive or destructive ways through different resonance mechanisms, and through the interaction of these properties, but I won't go into this here, and now we'll focus more on a dyadic level. So what you see here is a description of what I call these potentials of the bonds, these emergent properties. And they are potentials because they're there, but they're not necessarily activated. They exist as a potential. They become capacities when they're activated, and then they have effects over the individuals. And each one of those bonds can be activated in more positive ways and more negative ways, and they can change and fluctuate over time, but overall they build a pattern. And the dominant pattern will also establish a flavor, a feeling, and the nature and the character of that bond. Now, what I'd like to focus is that these emergent properties are, through their effects on the individuals, when they're activated on the positive pole, and they correspond to what we call a fuzzy pattern of love force, then they have really transformational effects, or potentially transformational effects over the individuals. I won't have time to detail all of these properties. I'm just going to give you one or two examples, like the extent to which, when the bond is activated, when that field of influence is there in a particular moment, and remember that it can decay over time, the individuals, for example, might be propelled to want to give their best. The wholeness potential means that the individuals under that particular setting, they feel that they experience themselves as part of a bigger whole. They feel integrated, they feel supported, they feel connected. The propelling potential is one that's commonly described by families that have to deal with multiple challenges, and they draw on the strength of their relationships as a sort of strength that comes from within. When they're under the influence of that relation, when they think about the other, something is activated that propels them for action, that gives them the motivation to pursue different types of routes that might bring about some benefit for the other to which they're bonded to, or to face adversity. The vitalizing energetic potential, the bond somehow gives the individual a feeling of being alive, of being awake, of being well, of feeling energized. And this energy comes from the bond, and it can be recruited even at the level of the individual. The expansion potential is particularly interesting because it relates to the expansion of the cognitive capacities when under the influence of the bond. It's somehow there's a slowing down of time and an enhancement of cognitive capacities. Individuals feel that they can solve problems better, they can reason better, they can find routes that they couldn't on their own because they're under the influence of the bond. And all of this other sorts of potentials relate to meaning and purpose that individuals find through the bond, relate to this experience, a temporary experience of happiness, of fulfillment, a feeling that in those moments of the activation of the bond, the individual doesn't really need anything, almost doesn't need anything else, because that moment they feel full, they feel happy. Another potential has to do to the extent that individuals feel that the bond kind of like propel them for learning, compel them to give better, to do more, to become something different. So there's, like I said, a big list of potentials, and I can look at them individually, but they will also interact amongst each other. And there are different ways of activating them. Now, they all are constructed through this relational machinery that is built through the individual contributions and the reciprocal coupling. But once they emerge, they can be activated without having to reenact the whole processes again. And some of these lower level properties might be key activators that when they're enacted, when they're practiced, like the focus of attention of the other, they somehow awake all those properties. Imagine them a bit like light bulbs that can be on or off, and that can decay in terms of their intensity through time unless you give them a boost of energy. So these activators can give this boost of energy, and the experience of the effects of that bonds depending on their nature, could really be transformational, can really be motivational, and can really drive change. And this is what we're trying to investigate. So the activators can be also at the level of other dimensions of family functioning, and there's a very strong relationship between these experiences and then the meanings that are created in the family. But I won't have time to talk about that. So of course, these experiences then can cut across different levels of organization of society, and the different systems interact with each other through these overall environments that are created through the bonds, but I can't go into that. I just wanted to call attention to the fact that the internal potential for change that's related to this activation of love force is only one dimension of the wider ecological, if you want, potential for change, but it is the driving one, the core one, the one that truly makes a difference. And then other dimensions might constrain it or potentiate it. And this has implications for how we conduct interventions, and this has implications for how we think about change. On the one hand, we need to see that the capacity, the potential to activate these experiences in the family is very much dependent on the complexity of their ecological organization. And for some families with a high potential, and where the amount of change that we're asking of them in terms of our target change, when that complexity is low, then maybe short interventions and focused interventions can work. But for others, we really need to work with more integrative approaches that work with all the constraining factors that are preventing that internal potential for change from being fully realized. But also what I'm proposing is that when we have interventions that aim at promoting individual change, for example, in relation to our patterns of consumption or how we behave in relation to climate change, then maybe we can couple those interventions with interventions focused on the activation of the internal potential for family change. Because when under the effect of those bonds, we can help the individuals connect with those properties through their relation with the persons that with the persons with whom they experience this activation of love force. And under that context, there might be a different type of motivation for change, and might be different types of resources being mobilized. So to some extent, family interventions focused on the activation of experiences of love force could really work as motivational or facilitating interventions, both promoting the change, but also facilitating and supporting the realization of that change during the whole process. So this framework still presents a lot of challenges. There are theoretical challenges that we're addressing, for example, understanding what are the core activators. They might be quite specific for a particular relational system, but others might be more cultural determined, and others might be more common. I'm convinced that some of them are quite common across different types of relations, but there are also methodological and empirical challenges on how to evaluate these dimensions, how to identify this activation, how to measure the dynamics of all of this process and its configurational complexity. And complexity science can probably give us some hints on how to do this. And there are also pragmatic challenges about how to develop interventions that could really be transformative and that could help us engage individuals in different types of patterns of change. What I'm currently doing, for example, is working to develop these interview protocols where we try to map the relational configuration of these properties and what could be the key activators for each family, and try to help them as a way to facilitate change, for example, in clinical contexts. But this talk is also a call for collaboration across these challenges, and I'll be very happy to engage in different types of conversations about this work and about possibilities of working together. So thank you for listening. These are my contacts, and we'll hope we can talk soon.